Welcome, everyone, to the Week 17 Waiver Wire show presented by the 33rd team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined with me, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Today, we're going to do something a little different. Folks, it's Week 17, and yesterday happened to be Christmas. We did not do our typical recap show, so today, we're only going to go through a few waiver wire ads because it's the Fantasy Football Championship. Anyone that we don't see starting for you this week does not matter. We'll not only touch on the top ads, but for those of you out there that have flown by the seat of your pants with quarterback, tight end, defense streamers, we've got a few of those options for you, the good people. Then we'll dive into some of the main Week 16 storylines and how that affects Week 17 and the NFL playoff picture. Ryan, let's dive right in. Why not start the show with Clyde Edwards-Helaire? He's only 36% rostered in Yahoo leagues. In week 14 and week 15, he averaged 12 carries, 4 targets, 85 total yards per game, 15 fantasy points a game. You might be like, well, why do we care about what he did in those 2 weeks? Well, Isaiah Pacheco has been concussed and Jerick McKinnon was put on IR. Those stats were all splitting some work with McKinnon. McKinnon's no longer there. I have Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a low-end fantasy RB1 this week. My fantasy rankings are on the33rdteam.com. Ryan, anything to add here? We've talked about him a couple weeks now where he just looks better than McKinnon, and now he's going to get all the work.
That's the thing, he's the only game in town. I'd want to call this a Chiefs bounce back spot, but I honestly don't have any real confidence in their offense. That said, they still should probably beat the Bengals and, positive game script, neutral game script. CH could get a big volume day.
Jerry Jeudy's 54% rostered, so available in some leagues, not others, but Cortland Sutton got concussed. The Broncos face a Chargers team that struggles in coverage. Broncos are on the very, very verge of being eliminated from the playoffs. I think their playoff odds right now are around 10, 15%. They essentially need to win this game. I have Jerry Jeudy just outside the fantasy wide receiver 2 range for week 17 because of target consolidation. Anything to add here to a player whose season has, quite frankly, just been disappointing?
Yeah, I know just about every week for props, I look at his props and they're right around 46.5. So, and I don't feel confident enough to bet on that regularly. That said, I do think there's extra upside here. And like you said, role usage increase potentially. I like the matchup. So I'm good with him as a streamer if needed.
Romeo Doubs is available in a little over 40% of leagues. Christian Watson has a hamstring injury. Jaden Reed has a toe injury. Dontavian Wicks has a chest injury that he picked up this past week. This might be the last man standing for the Packers. They face the Vikings this week, the 8th best matchup for fantasy receivers when you adjust for schedule. I have him as a fantasy wide receiver 3. And I think one other thing that we'll talk about more in a little bit is that the Packers' struggling defense might actually help the pass attack when they have to keep pace.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of confidence in Green Bay in any facet right now, but again, if you're desperate, I think Dobbs is a solid option.
This is an interesting one. The Bears backfield, Khalil Herbert is available in more than half of fantasy leagues. It feels almost impossible to predict how the backfield goes each week. Deonta Foreman had some kind of personal issue, so he didn't play last week. And then Herbert, not Roschon Johnson, got almost all the work. Roschon got a couple goal line carries in there. He just didn't convert. But ultimately, Khalil Herbert's the one that had 20 carries for 112 yards and a touchdown. He ran 13 routes to Roschon Johnson's 14. So neck and neck in the receiving department. Herbert, the absolute bell cow on the ground. They face the Falcons. I think Herbert gets the first crack. I have him as a fantasy running back 3 in my rankings because of the uncertainty, but I don't think it would surprise anyone at this point if he just does what he did last week. How would you handle him?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. Running back 3 because of the volatility, but if you need upside, you could do worse. My only concern, like you said, is if Foreman comes back. Is this some kind of, undesirable split? But I think the Bears are going to win this game too, so I like Herbert.
The last player to talk about for waiver ads will be Rashid Shaheed. He is a speedy secondary option in the Saints offense, and he gets the Buccaneers. We like that. He just had 9 targets. That was a 23% target share. He caught 5 for 70 yards and a touchdown. His average depth of target was 15 yards downfield. That's a lot. That was over 130 air yards against the Rams on Thursday night. The Saints are absolutely desperate. They have to beat the Buccaneers to remain on the fringes of playoff contention. Anything to add here? I know Jordan Vanek was all over him having the blow-up game. Did you like what you saw from him on Thursday night?
Yeah, I mean, Shaheed's a good player. I've mentioned this a few times when, before Henry Ruggs' legal incident, he was starting with Send and Derek Carr's offense. Shaheed's the closest thing that the Saints have to a guy that can fill that role. And, to beat Tampa, you got to throw on him. So I could see this being a good game for Olave and Shaheed, both DFS viable guys.
I'd agree there. Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. His NFL power rankings are on the site. Let's see if the Niners are still number one after yesterday's meltdown. I don't want to spoil it. They're free on the 33rd team.com. You should be checking them out. He has survivor thoughts for anyone that is still live or that did one of those buyback type options for week 17. You should be reading all his content. Thursday, his expert picks and predictions for those week 17 games come out. Let's turn to quarterback streamers. Russell Wilson gets the Chargers. He's averaging 18 fantasy points per game himself. The Chargers allow 21 fantasy points a game to passers. If you adjust for schedule, quarterbacks score 3.5 more fantasy points than expected against the Chargers. Only the Commanders have been more of a sieve against quarterbacks this year. So if you add 18 and 3.5, you get 21.5. That's not quite how this works, but it shows you sort of the upside and what you can hopefully get out of Russ if you're streaming in week 17.
What a disaster that game last week on Christmas Eve was for Denver. So that's something that I find interesting here. Denver's desperate. They're probably cost themselves a playoff berth with that loss. You can throw in the Chargers. Well, the Chargers gave a much better effort against the Bills last week. This is not a very good team. If Russell Wilson's going to have a spike game, this is a week for it.
We already talked about the Saints a little bit. Derek Carr is at the Tampa Bay Bucks. It's a pass funnel defense. They're desperate. Carr just threw for 300 yards on Thursday. He could do it again against this defense. I don't really think it's going to be a huge chimera on the ground game based on this defense. We don't love Derek Carr in fantasy, but 300 yards and 2 touchdowns is a possibility here.
This is the best way I can put this, Josh. I will look for Derek Carr over passing yards to see what that number is among the first 5 things I look at on Thursday when lines come out.
I was thinking that too. Folks, Friday, Ryan and I, our data scientist, Ahan Rungta, will do the player prop happy hour. I will definitely be looking at some of these Saints overs. Nick Mullins hosts the Green Bay Packers on Sunday Night Football. Oh boy, Ryan. He's thrown for at least 300 yards and 2 touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. He threw for the double fours this past weekend. Over 400 passing yards, 4 interceptions as well. The Packers just allowed 300 yards and 2 passing touchdowns to Bryce Young. We'll touch on that more shortly. The reason that we don't want to talk about Mullins too favorably, not just because of the interceptions, but TJ Hawkinson, ACL injury, out for the season. Jordan Addison has an ankle sprain. He's kind of 50-50 to play. And then it's mostly just Justin Jefferson that he's throwing to, which is not great.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way I'll frame this, Josh. Apart from, the 4 interceptions and 400 yards passing last week, that makes you have to at least consider Mullins. I'm a pretty bold guy when it comes to making decisions in this stuff. I don't play with fear. I don't exactly want to make a decision that involves Nick Mullins with thousands of dollars potentially on the line. So I'm going to personally go in a different direction if I have to stream a quarterback this week.
Yeah, we both prefer Russell Wilson. We both prefer Derek Carr. And one other guy that we do not prefer is Joe Flacco against the Jets. It's a Thursday night game. We already don't like those. There might be some weather in Cleveland. Flacco's had a great run. Are you with me that after what we saw from Sam Howell and company last week against the Jets, I am pretty terrified about Flacco in the elements on Thursday night against the Jets.
Yeah, not only are you playing a high quality pass defense, like he was a Jet last year. They're familiar with him. They've played him in practice. So no thanks for me. Although, I'll say it again, Joe Flacco has saved the Browns season. Just don't put him in a position to cost you your fantasy championship this week.
Yeah, saved the Browns season. Yeah. It is a revenge game, quote unquote, because he was on the Jets last year. And we wrote this up at one point. Ryan, I have a 40-1 Super Bowl ticket on the Browns. And what I'm seeing right now really makes me bummed that Watson is not only out for the season, but didn't return to form, because that 40-1 was would have looked pretty nice if we had even like a top 15 quarterback at the helm there.
Oh yeah, like 90% of 2020 Watson. I think it's them and the Ravens, honestly.
I would agree there. Let's turn to some tight end streamers. We'll stop lamenting the past. Tucker Kraft at the Vikings. Kraft, the past 2 weeks, has 4 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown. And then once again, 4 catches for 60 yards, 6 targets both games. There's a litany of injuries in this Packers receiver room. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Tucker Kraft might be the guy you need at tight end this week.
Might be. I know when we did our preseason draft guide, I like Tucker Kraft as a prospect. I was actually kind of annoyed he went to the same spot as Luke Musgrave because I think they're kind of equivalent talents. So volatile offense, but I do like the upside for Kraft.
Yeah, we talked about how we liked him. He was a North Dakota State product, and we said he's very raw. He probably won't do much this year, and he'll just play behind Musgrave. But long term, it wasn't clear who was better, and we're starting to see that his production's been better than Musgrave. Juwan Johnson at the Buccaneers. It's just another Saint. He scored each of the past 2 games. Target volume's been really shaky. It's the right matchup. If you want a guy that can get in the box, he's one of the better streaming options this week.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to play any pass catcher in New Orleans in this matchup if possible.
Our waiver guru, Nick Bodiford, has always been a Chigoziem Okonkwo guy. And he broke through this past week with Ryan Tannehill at the helm. They're traveling to Houston, a divisional game. Titans are out of the playoff picture, but I'm sure they would enjoy playing spoiler against their division rival. His 6 targets were a 25% target share. They were the team lead this past week with Tannehill over DeAndre Hopkins. He caught all 6 targets for 63 yards and a touchdown. He probably doesn't repeat that. But should Tannehill start, I don't think he's the worst option to throw out there either.
The thing that I'll add here, too, is if CJ Stroud officially starts in this game, there's actually some sneaky high-scoring potential. I like Chigoziem Okonkwo more in that scenario.
Ryan, I want to pat you on the back. You said his name. I think this is the first time that we've ever podcasted where you said his full name. So we celebrate these small victories. Let's talk about defensive streamers, your wheelhouse, defensive analysis. You like the Jaguars this week against the Panthers, even though Bryce Young just lit up the Packers.
Yeah, more on the Packers defense later. If Trevor Lawrence plays in this game, I am interested in the Jaguars because I think they'll play with a lead. If he doesn't, I'd remove them from the top 12 completely. So volatile option in general, definitely passing if CJ Beathard's at the helm.
Seahawks, they host what should be Mason Rudolph's Steelers.
Yeah, Seattle, the problem with the Seahawks this year has actually been their offense. I'd say that's underwhelmed. The defense has been pretty good over the last, 2/3 of the season. And, Mason Rudolph had a spike game last week. That's nice. I could see a couple interceptions in Seattle in a game where both teams desperately need a win.
The Bears defense, they've been surging. They get the Falcons. Seems like it's going to be Taylor Heineke again. He played a little better than Ritter's been playing this past week, but it's still Taylor Heineke.
Yeah, ultimately, I've been higher than consensus on the Bears for a while now. And then on the other side of things, the Falcons are an every other week type team. 1 week their talent shows up and they win. The next week they bomb. I want to bet against their quarterback situation in Chicago the last day of December with, the absolute volatility of their coaching staff and quarterback situation.
That's true. Could be a weather game as well. Texans defense against the Titans. You mentioned might be a sneaky shootout. Texans defense hasn't been all that bad. And it's not like we're all that in love with Tannehill or Levis, right?
Right. Yeah, there you go. There's 2 factors here for me. If Stroud plays, they probably played for a lead. They need to win this game big time. And then the Titans offensive line's a mediocre group at best. So I could see some sacks and turnovers in that situation.
We're still not sure who we get at quarterback for the Giants. If I were them, I'd roll with Tyrod Taylor. He played much better than DeVito. DeVito's just been a sack-taking machine. I think you probably like this one better if it's DeVito. The Rams traveling to New York to face the Giants.
Regardless of which quarterback starts for the Giants, my expert picks score prediction will be 27-13 Rams. So I like them playing with a lead against the Giants. I think Tyrod's probably less likely to make mistakes than DeVito in a negative game script, but either regardless of which quarterback's there, I like the Rams defense because of the matchup.
Then the Colts defense, they've gotten a lot of sacks this year. They face Aiden O'Connell's Raiders. Despite the score, if anyone watched that game, the win was not Aiden O'Connell. This team didn't have an offensive touchdown. I think he threw for 60 yards or something ridiculous. So therefore the Colts have some kind of upside, right?
There was some wild stat where like he didn't have a passing yard in 3 quarters or something like that. Just crazy stuff. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of him as a prospect. When he's under duress, he's a pretty dicey player. So like you said, the Colt, wouldn't call the Colts defense a good defense, but they've overachieved in fantasy, and this is a good matchup for him.
I confirm top of my head, I was right. 62 passing yards. He completed 43% of his passes.
Nice.
This is partly why quarterback wins, or wins are not always a quarterback stat, folks. Let's now turn to recapping some of the Week 16 action. Rapid fire. We talked about it earlier. Ryan, Isaiah Pacheco, he's concussed. The Chiefs just lost to the Raiders in Arrowhead. They scored fewer than 20 points for the 7th time this season. Mahomes was under pressure all game. To me, it seems like the receivers, the offensive line were partially to blame here. And then I would also blame this Chiefs run defense. It's been beatable all year. We've talked about it a few times. Zamir White filled in for Josh Jacobs, had 22 carries, 145 rushing yards. What do you want to add here? The Chiefs at this point, I think they're in crisis mode. Mahomes, Kelsey, everyone was yelling at each other throughout the game. The vibes have to be at an all-time low for the Chiefs right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time like things have really gone wrong for them. And I thought you were going to blame Mahomes some, because I actually think this game is the worst game I've ever seen him play as a pro. You know, I'm not keeping score exactly, so I don't want to make that like, write that in stone, but I think it might be. I moved in the 10th in my power rankings. I've been stubborn about that because of their pedigree, but this is a team that could lose in the first round of the playoffs. Like I could see CJ Stroud's Texans going to Arrowhead and beating them in the first round.
I could too. You've mentioned a few times this Colts team has outperformed their true talent level. You've mentioned Jake Browning's going to get exposed soon as a mediocre backup quarterback. This week, it happened. Colts lost 29-10 to Arthur Smith's Falcons. The Bengals lost 34-11 to Mason Rudolph's Steelers. Colts, Bengals, they're now 8-7, but they're still on the fringes of playoff contention. Should we start grouping them in with the Denver Broncos, who I believe their playoff odds now are 8%. They lost 26-23 to the Patriots. Their record is 7-8. How are you feeling about these teams?
Brutal loss, especially for those guys in Circus Survivor with so much money on the line that took Denver. Oh man. But yeah, I think the Colts have a shot because they play the Texans in the last game of the season. That has some winning in vibes a little bit. I do think if either the Colts or the Bengals get in the playoffs, they're going to get smoked. So I kind of want one of them to get in for betting purposes in that regard. But like, if one of them has to play Miami or Buffalo, like I want to bet on that game. So that's my hope. But yeah, I think the Cinderella story with Jake Browning's done. And the Colts are this year's Giants, just the overachieving team that's record is much better than what they actually are.
If I remember correctly, wasn't the guy who was very, very outspoken about how he didn't want to chop the Circa prize for $9 million? And then he had the Broncos.
Yeah. I feel bad for the other guys who probably wanted to chop and had Denver, but yeah, that's dicey stuff, man.
Yeah, that's what you get when you turn down nearly $2 million, folks. It often doesn't end well.
Yeah.
We were wrong, Ryan. We were wrong. Anyone, even the Jets, can put up points against the Commanders. We were skeptical of Trevor Siemian. Like, he didn't get there in fantasy, but ultimately this was an offense that we were not correct about. Jets, 217 passing yards, 164 rushing yards, 3 offensive touchdowns against the Commanders. 49ers are in the perfect bounce back spot against the Commanders this week. I just wouldn't want to face a single 49er. I would be pretty terrified if I'm going up against any of them this week. Anything else to add about this Commanders defense?
Yeah, that is the correction spot of all correction spots. If the 49ers beat Washington 49-0, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I put money this morning on the Commanders, or the Niners minus 13.5. I think that's going to move to at least minus 14. I don't see how they don't win by at least 2 touchdowns. Let's turn to the AFC South. Are the Texans better than the Jaguars? The Jaguars lost to Tampa Bay 30-12 this past weekend. Trevor Lawrence has some kind of shoulder injury. The defense has underwhelmed recently, and CJ Stroud should be returning for the Texans from his concussion.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes in general. I just think Houston's better than now, primarily because Lawrence is banged up. But if CJ Beathard's the quarterback, I actually think the Colts are better than the Jaguars at this point. So I think Houston's in the driver's seat to walk away with the division here.
Bryce Young threw for 312 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions against the Packers. I want some comments on this Packers defense. And do we have hope that Bryce Young's momentum carries rest of season? He faces the Jaguars and the Buccaneers the next 2 weeks. Those are both pretty good matchups for quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think long term he can be fine. Jordan, you and I have talked about this a little bit. I think a lot of it's, play calling and the supporting cast for Young. I think he can be fine, but not sure I want to bet on him this year. But, last week was encouraging. That said, Josh, Green Bay, I don't remember the exact number of first-round picks they have on their defense, but they have a ton of, legitimately good players on defense.
They do.
This team giving up 30 points to the Panthers this week when their season's on the line with the talent they have in that group, the Panthers, literally score, 13 points every week. They're unwatchable. And all of a sudden, they're lighting you up when you have, 5 first-round picks and you have legitimately at least borderline star players at every level. I don't know what the problem there is, but my Lord, please fix the defense in Green Bay next year.
Yeah, I have to say, I lost a fantasy matchup this week because I streamed the Packers defense. I felt pretty good about it going in.
Yeah.
That was a mistake.
Yeah, I played him too, man.
Ryan, you've talked all year. Matthew Stafford should, if you were judging, would be in the MVP conversation because he's played in an elite level this year. The Rams are actually very dangerous. Right now, it's looking like Rams-Lions might face off round 1 of the playoffs. Who wins in that scenario?
I think the Rams are going to beat them in that scenario. I think Detroit, maybe they get healthy on defense. Maybe the defense improves at the right time. But right now, Matthew Stafford's going to carve them up. And like you said, Josh, credit to Puka Nacua, but Matthew Stafford's a big reason why this guy's maybe going to break the all-time rookie single season record. I'm not sure he's that good of a talent. Stafford made Kenny Golladay a tremendous amount of money. DeMarcus Robinson's having spike games. Cooper Kupp a couple years ago had a Jerry Rice type season. Cooper Kupp's a good player, but Stafford's a talent elevator. Guy's been phenomenal this year. The fact that this team's going to make the playoffs is one of the biggest surprises of the year for me.
We have a lot of listeners who play fantasy football. In fact, I'd say all of them do. And I should also just mention Kyron Williams. The guy reached 1,000 rushing yards this year. He missed a lot of time and still did it. He's in the CMC role and performing admirably. And you have to think Stafford's a huge part of that as well. Let's turn to the aftermath from last night's game, a potential Super Bowl preview. It was the Ravens and the 49ers. If we look at Brock Purdy, he had 255 passing yards, 8 yards per pass attempt. That's all very good. And then you look and you see that he had no passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions. We look at the other side. I thought as a casual football watcher, Ryan, we'll get your thoughts in a second, that Lamar's mobility kind of neutralized the Niners pass rush. Lamar had, I checked the stats, just over 3 seconds for his average time to throw. That's very, very high. That's the second highest by a quarterback versus the Niners this year. The only quarterback higher was Jalen Hurts. Potentially the Niners might have a problem moving forward against some of these more mobile quarterbacks. What are your takeaways for that Ravens-Niners game?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to touch on all the stuff you said because I think that's actually how this game was won. First, the Ravens secondary closed windows for Brock Purdy. Purdy's been really good this year. There's been some Drew Brees comparisons, and I don't think they're completely crazy because he's been an assassin a lot this year. Mm-hmm. But Ravens forced tight windows, a couple tit passes, a couple, Hamilton, that first pick he had changed the complexion of that game because the 49ers were just steamrolling them. And, he stopped a scoring drive. And that was the first big difference of that game. 5 interceptions. The Ravens defense, drove that win. On the other side, I agree with you completely. The 49ers pass rush, not only was the Ravens offensive line really good, but they were chipping Nick Bosa effectively all night. They were getting tight ends and running backs into the mix. I know when the Ravens play the Steelers, they always have such a great game plan for TJ Watt. And I always say, they treat it like a pitcher would. They throw different looks at elite pass rushers, and that's what they did to Bosa. But to your point with Lamar Jackson, I mean, he's, we say this all the time, him and Michael Vick are the best rushing quarterbacks of all time. And 2 comments on that. One is Lamar Jackson made 4 or 5 plays with his legs where he bought time that were just incredible. One in particular, no one else in the history of the sport makes that play except maybe Vick. And 2, in some situations, I actually think he should run more, because when I watch Ravens games, a lot of their scoring drives come down to a 3rd and 12 or 3rd and 8 where he picks it up with his legs, and I think that's the difference in their offense. Good passer, but he's just an incredible runner.
Now let's turn to the MVP picture. Odds are shifting heavily. Heading into this game, Brock Purdy was the MVP favorite. That is long gone. Lamar Jackson is now the favorite on DraftKings, minus 160. It's about a 60% implied chance that he would win if you want to bet on that. McCaffrey is at 4-1. And then Purdy is now at 12-1. What are your thoughts here? Is this an overreaction? It feels like it might be an overreaction when one game can shift them this much, but you are the expert here.
I like the word overreaction because, yes, you know, the field overreacts to one game all the time. That said, this was a nationally televised game late in the season. I find those to be, in my process, I value them more because more people see them. I don't think every awards voter is a maniac watching every game like I am. But, you know, here's what I'm going to say, Josh. This is a very unique MVP race because Lamar Jackson's off the pace in every category that matters. You know, just to name a few: EPA per play, QBR rating. Jordan Love, I just put it on Twitter. Jordan Love has more touchdowns than Lamar Jackson this season. Russell Wilson has more touchdowns than Lamar Jackson this season. He hasn't been productive enough to be MVP, but, you know, the Ravens are the best team in football right now. And generally speaking, the best performing quarterback for one of the two number one seeds wins the MVP more times than not. Purdy had a meltdown game, but he's still having an MVP caliber season, and the 49ers are probably going to win the number one seed. So I don't think he's done. The big issue there is McCaffrey's still lurking. So I think if you want to kind of get off not awarding either quarterback, I actually think McCaffrey might win. And then, you know, the other quarterbacks that are they're at least approachable from a production standpoint. Josh Allen, a little bit off the pace in some categories, but he's there in touchdowns, and I think it's QBR. Buffalo wins out. He's at least part of the conversation. And, you know, Dak Prescott has a prime time game against the Lions. I think them having 5 losses might, you know, eliminate him unless Philly melts down against 2 sub 500 teams. But Prescott's also having it from a production standpoint an MVP caliber season. So I personally can't wait to see what voters actually value the most here.
Yeah, all good points there. I thought McCaffrey's rushing touchdown last night was one of the best single runs I've seen all season.
Sure.
He looks like the best running back in football, maybe one of the best singular players in football at his position.
I think he might legitimately win, especially like you mentioned, the Commanders. You know, if Brock Purdy throws for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns, that's possible. If Christian McCaffrey has 200 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns, it might catapult him.
Yeah, I think with all the money on the line this week, I think I'd actually be surprised if whoever wins all these big fantasy tournaments, best ball tournaments, if these winning lineups don't have at least one 49ers player in it.
Yeah.
Ryan, I got one last question for you. The Dolphins just beat the Cowboys. Not an impressive win, but it is a win, 22-20. Their first win this year against a team that was above 500. They travel to the Ravens in Baltimore. Baltimore, not so fast, folks. They're coming off a massive win, but it is also a short week for them because they just played on Monday night. Tua is actually sandwiched between McCaffrey, Purdy. He is 10-1 to an MVP right now. Do you have any early predictions or thoughts on Tua and how this Dolphins-Ravens game shakes out?
First, real quick on MVP for Tua. I think this is the rare situation where I think Tyreek Hill would have to win it over him just because Tyreek Hill is, you know, accounted for such a huge portion of his production. So I think that's like an oddity in this where, you know, then again, if Tua beats Lamar Jackson and now plays him, and, you know, we saw last year, these two teams, you know, I think they went over 90 points together, you know, so Miami can win this game. And generally speaking, this is like a classic letdown spot for Baltimore playing their best game of the season against the best team in the league. Now they play another good team in Miami. You know, my concern here is Hill's banged up and maybe Waddle misses. So this game ultimately boils down to the health of the Dolphins receivers. If those two guys are a full go, I actually think Miami's going to beat Baltimore.
I like that take. Folks, if you want all of Ryan's picks and predictions for every game, those will come out Thursday on the33rdteam.com. He is Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. Make sure you are following him. Make sure you keep up with his offseason plans with Blake Lively, with his European football team during the offseason. Yeah, apparently I even confuse myself sometimes trying to figure out who the real Ryan Reynolds is. Folks, from myself, Josh Larky, from my co-host, Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team, we wish you good luck for week 17. Make sure you hop in our free Discord. We will be helping you with the start sits. We will be helping you trying to make that push. We have a lot of money on the line this week. We know you do as well. Thanks for tuning in, folks.